Hello, we're glad to see that you're here to learn about debugging. As we progress through this demo, we'll learn how to debug a pre-built workflow, catch errors, use the different debugging actions, and make use of the Locals panel. Alright, let's begin. Let's take a look at the project that we'll use to showcase the debugging features. The workflow begins by reading employee data from an Excel file, then opens a browser window, navigates to a web form, and enters employee data into the form. This is how the data looks like. This is the employee information form where the robot will enter the data. Let's run the project to see what happens. We get a runtime execution error while entering the data into the form. The input string isn't in the correct format. We can find more information by clicking the Details button. Let's click OK and see how we can use the debugging features to investigate the error. We have quite a few options to help us identify and solve errors. Let's check them out in the Debug ribbon. The Open Logs button will open the Logs folder where the logs are stored locally. Profile Execution helps us to identify performance issues in workflow executions. The Remote Debugging feature lets us check how an automation performs on a different machine. Remote Debugging lets us run and debug attended and unattended processes on robots deployed to remote machines. The Picture-in-Picture (PIP) ribbon option is available for both executing and debugging processes or libraries in a separate session on a machine. Once enabled, whenever we click Run or Run File, Debug or Debug File, the process starts in the PIP session. When enabled, the Continue on Exception button logs thrown exceptions as they happen and yet continues the execution. The Log Activities button lets us disable or enable displaying debugged activities as trace logs in the output panel at verbose level. Disabling log activities can be a way to send smaller log files to Orchestrator. The Highlight Elements button lets us disable or enable highlighting UI elements during debugging. The Execution Trail button shows the exact execution path of the workflow during debugging. It marks and highlights each activity in the Designer panel during execution. The Slow Step button decreases the execution speed, letting us take a closer look at activities during debugging. When it's enabled, activities are highlighted in the debugging process. This action comes with 4 different speeds. Debugging with Slow Step at 1 time runs the workflow the slowest, while debugging with Slow Step at 4 times runs it the fastest. We'll click it twice to set the speed to 2 times and we'll go back to the top level. It's good to know that Execution Trail, Highlight Elements, Log Activities, Continue on Exception, Picture-in-Picture, Remote Debugging, and Profile Execution can only be toggled before debugging. What's more, the options we select for Slow Step, Execution Trail, Continue on Exception, Picture-in-Picture, Highlight Elements, Log Activities, and Profile Execution are saved in Studio and will persist across projects. Let's check our execution options. We can click the Debug File button to debug the current workflow file. Run File to run the current file, Debug to run the entire project in debug mode, or Run to execute the entire project in run mode. Let's click the Debug option and quickly pause the execution to have a look. And we're in debug mode. Let's click the Break button. Currently, execution is in a paused state. Clicking Continue will resume execution and goes through all of the activities from top to bottom. Clicking Stop will terminate the execution and exit the debugging mode. By using Step Into, Step Over, and Step Out, we can execute activities one by one or in larger groups. We'll learn more about them later in this video. Let's click Continue and see what happens when the execution reaches the error in debug mode. The robot enters the data into the fields. UI elements that it interacts with are highlighted in green and their anchors are highlighted in blue. And here it is. The Assign Mobile Number activity has thrown an error. When an error is thrown in debug mode, the execution is paused and the activity throwing the error is highlighted in red in the Designer panel. The error message is also displayed in the Output panel. In our case, the error message reads input string was not in a correct format. This implies that the data type of the variable and the assigned value might not match. Double-clicking it here will open the message in a separate window. In the Exceptions section of the Locals panel, we see the same exception. Clicking the magnifying glass icon here will open the Local Value window with more details about the error. We'll learn more about the Locals panel in a few moments. Okay, let's check what our options are for continuing. We can click Retry. This action re-executes the previous activity and throws the exception if the activity encounters the error again. Clicking Ignore will bypass the exception and continue the execution from the next activity, so that we can continue debugging the rest of the workflow. Clicking Restart will re-execute the debugging process from the first activity of the project. Note that we can also use Step Out, Step Over, Step Into, Stop and Continue, depending on how we plan to address the error. Let's take a moment to have a closer look at the Locals panel. The Locals panel is only available in debug mode and it displays exceptions, arguments, variables, properties of the previously executed activity, and properties of the current activity. As shown earlier, here we can find information about the thrown exception, but we can also see all of the variables in our workflow and their current values. For example, the first name, last name, mobile phone number, the user's data table, and so on. Whenever a value changes during execution, we'll see it in the Locals panel. Here, we can also see the properties of the previously executed activity and of the current one. In our case, the previous one was assign activity to get the value of mobile number as a string from a data row. And the current one is the assign activity to pass the mobile number. A very useful feature of the Locals panel is the ability to modify variables on the spot. Here's how it works. Now we know that the exception was thrown when the assign activity tried to pass a mobile phone number. Let's click the View More icon for the mobile number string variable to edit it. The phone number contains a letter. Let's change it to 3 and click OK. Click Retry to re-execute the activity. Great, our execution continues and is entering the data in the other fields. We can also edit the properties of the current activity in the Locals panel. This means that we can use it to test different selectors, input methods, or other properties. It's important to remember that changing variables or properties in the Locals panel doesn't persist in the workflow. In other words, if we run the workflow again or restart debugging, we'll encounter the same error. Local panel values hold valid only for that instance of debugging. So, let's test this. Let's restart debugging this file again. As expected, an error has occurred again. Now we know that the data is in the wrong format and the source of data is the Excel file. So, let's check the data in the Excel file and see if we can fix it. We also know that the error message is input string was not in a correct format. Finally, we know that it was in the first row since the execution didn't go past the first run through the for each row in data table activity. So, it's very likely that the first phone number isn't in the correct format. And indeed, the first phone number contains a letter. Let's change it to 3. Save and close the file. Next, we want to check if this solves the issue. Let's go back to the top level, scroll down, and make sure that we select the first sequence after the Enter Mobile Phone Number sequence. It's the Enter City, State, Zip one. Let's right-click the Toggle a Breakpoint option that will pause the execution when reached. Clicking the Breakpoints button again would disable the breakpoint, and clicking it a third time would remove it. We'll learn more about breakpoints later in this course. Let's click Restart. OK, our workflow is running. Let's see what happens when it reaches the mobile phone number field. Great, it works. Since we've set up a breakpoint, execution is paused before entering the Enter City State Zip sequence. Let's take this opportunity to check what Step Into, Step Over, and Step Out do. Our current sequence contains an Assign activity and a Type Into activity. Step Into will debug the activities one at a time. This means that it'll pause after every step. When we click this action, the debug mode opens and highlights the activity before it's executed. Let's click it once. Note that it runs the Assign activity. Let's click it again. It jumps to Type Into activity. Let's click it for the third time. Now it's executing the Type Into activity. While Step Into executes the activities step by step, Step Over won't open the current container. When used, this action debugs the next activity, highlighting containers without opening them. This action is useful when we want to quickly go through large containers, which are unlikely to trigger any issues during execution. Let's have a look at the Enter Birthday container. Using Step Over will execute everything inside the container and will pause only after it exits the container. Let's click it once. We've jumped into the Enter Birthday sequence. Let's click it again. It executes everything inside the container and then pauses. Let's click it a few more times. We've reached the Enter Civil Status sequence. Let's click it again. Everything inside the container is executed. Finally, let's have a look at Step Out. Clicking Step Out will run the activities in the current container before pausing the debugging. In our case, it'll execute the remaining activities until it reaches the body container. It completed the run of the for each activity and paused before starting over with the next row. Now that we've seen the features in action, let's remove the breakpoint using the Breakpoints panel and continue to debug the workflow. The execution is completed successfully and Studio exits debug mode. In the output panel, we can see that our execution ended in 7 minutes and 20 seconds. In this demo, we've covered various aspects of debugging, such as how to interpret and fix errors while in debug mode, what are the different debugging actions that we can use, how to make use of the Locals panel. To further practice debugging in UiPath Studio, add some deliberate errors to your workflow, such as entering an incorrect selector or specifying an invalid value. This will allow you to test and explore the available debugging actions and tools in more depth. Thank you for watching and see you soon.